Hi, Zoomies. Thanks, Shaman, and welcome, Zoomies, to the Zoom Talk with Minda Harts. I'm so excited to kick off this conversation with each of you today. Minda is a speaker and thought leader, frequently speaking on topics like advancing women of color, leadership, diversity, and entrepreneurship. In 2018, Minda was named as one of 25 emerging innovators by American Express. She is the author of the memo, okay, maybe not. What women of color need to know to secure a seat at the table in the workplace, a seat at the table and right within how to heal from racial trauma in the workplace. And today we're going to dive a little bit into psychological safety, healing, trauma, and self-care in the workplace, and the particular issues facing Black women at work. But before we get started, Minda, I'd love for you to share a few paragraphs from your most recent book, Right Within, How to Heal from Racial Trauma in the Workplace, and I'll toss it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Honored to be here with all of you. I know you could be anywhere on the internet and you're here with us. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book before we jump into the conversation. So I'm reading from a chapter called Maintenance because I believe our healing is not a one-time event, but a lifestyle, and you're always going to need some tools to help you on your journey to healing. Maintenance strategies really can make or break your healing progression. I remember attending a working lunch with an executive at my office. Let's call him Keith. I was staffing him for an important client meeting to close a significant deal. I considered this executive a good and decent man, and we got along great. I had no reason to think he didn't have my back. But then again, we had never been in a situation that would require him to have my back. At any rate, we sat down for lunch and waited on the clients, who were running about 10 minutes late. The clients were a married couple. The husband, John, was a white male, and his wife, Connie, was a woman of color. I had spent time with Connie before, and we had a good rapport. I had met John briefly, but never spent any real time with him. To make a long story short, another Black man had been murdered by the police recently, and the story was dominating the news. And somehow it came up in conversation. At one point during lunch, John says, "I just don't get it. Why has it taken Black people so long to get themselves together? I mean, look what happened with the Japanese, and they have been able to accomplish so much." My mouth dropped to the floor. Like, dude, you know I'm the part of those Black people you speak of. I was beyond surprised, and I could see Connie and Keith trying to look away while John proceeded to keep his foot in his mouth. Before I knew it, I said, "I disagree. You can't compare 100 years of racial oppression that Black people faced in this country to Japanese people's experience in this country. Yes, they've experienced racial bias, yet many of those families did receive a form of reparations as well. But clearly John was trying to pit one group who was oppressed by white people against another, which in my opinion is an anti-Black position." I remember taking a sip of water and saying an internal prayer that Connie would stop this jerk or that Keith would chime in, but neither of them said a mumbling word. They let him continue to inflict his ignorance of Black people on the only Black person sitting at the table. If my face could turn red, I'm sure that it would have. And at that point, I was determined not to go back and forth with this fool who had been sleeping during all of his history classes. I ended the conversation with, "Maybe this is a conversation we should save for dinner and drinks." I awkwardly laughed and shifted the topic back to the reason we were at lunch in the first place. After lunch, I was riding in the car with Keith and secretly hoping he might say something about what had transpired. But yet again, he was a colleague who couldn't or wouldn't step up when I needed him. His stop came first, and when he got out of the car, I felt tears well up in my eyes. I was triggered. Keith might as well have put me back in the office with Carrie. For some reason, I expected more from him. But then again, why did I? I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted him to see me in that moment and feel what I felt. I wanted him to care. Also, I wanted to believe that Keith was different than my former colleagues who watched the racialized situations go down and did nothing. It's because of situations like this and others that I had to incorporate maintenance strategies, because my day doesn't end after someone says some BS. I still have to continue to work, take care of my family, and be present. And I had to learn not to allow those racialized experiences to paralyze the rest of my day. I refused to let racism have power over me anymore. Later that evening, I met back up with Keith for dinner with some new clients, not John and Connie, thank God. We both arrived early to chat about our game plan for the dinner. When I was in the situation with Carrie, I hadn't advocated for myself in the ways that I wanted to due to fear. This time, I got the courage to casually bring up the situation that had transpired at lunch. I asked Keith what he thought about what John had said. He seemed surprised that I had brought it up and replied, "Well, you know, I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." And when he said those words, I felt like Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners. I wanted to take Keith straight to the moon. For the love of God, this man had the audacity to sit and eat his lunch that we paid for and look me straight in the eye and make the case that Black people could have had a better shot at the American dream, but didn't work as hard as the Japanese. And Keith had the nerve to tell me he didn't mean any harm. What the hell did John mean then, Keith? Right within.
That was a perfect excerpt to lead us into the conversation. So I'm going to dive right in, Minda, and I want to talk about this concept of psychological safety, right? How do we make this real in the workplace and not just a concept that people talk about? And what does that look like? What is psychological safety?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think that, we use this really pretty word, psychological safety, and we throw it out there into the workplace as if it just happens on its own, like it's a chia pet, right? Like you just pour water in it and all of a sudden we have psychological safety. But psychological safety doesn't happen just because we say it out loud. It happens with intentionality, right? Amy Edmondson, she's the one who coined the phrase psychological safety. And it's about when fear is present. You can't be safe if fear is present. So let's pull it back. If I don't feel safe enough to bring my experiences to my manager or to another colleague, then this is not a safe space for me, right? I should be able to say how I feel and create boundaries without fear of losing my job, right? And when fear is there, then harm is present, and then people can't do the best work of their careers, right? They can't focus on what they've been hired to do because now I have all these added pressures and taxes on now trying to also navigate creating safety for myself. And so I think it's great to say that we need psychological safety, but if you are one of few in the workplace, you're often moving into what another gentleman calls prudent paranoia, right? The more you worry, the more you notice. The more you notice, the more you worry. And you cannot be safe if you're constantly walking on eggshells or feeling like you can't bring the most authentic pieces of yourself. And so I know for a lot of Black women in particular and people of color, when we do experience situations that I just read about, we typically don't say anything. We just sweep them under the rug, right? And again, that's not creating safety if we don't all feel that equity is present for us to be able to voice those concerns, be it, good or bad.
Right. I love that. And I think the excerpt and the situations that you talk about kind of lead to workplace trauma, right? So what is the connection between psychological safety and workplace trauma? What is the connection there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I use the word trauma because I really want to get that point across. Like, this is traumatic. I spent 15 years in my former life. Every single day I went to work, I felt some type of aggression, right? You could call it macro, you can call it micro, whatever you want to deem it as. But at the end of the day, it was racism, in my opinion, right? But I never wanted to call it that. I never wanted to say it out loud, right? And so I would always be, again, walking on those eggshells. If someone said something to me, then I clearly took it the wrong way, or I have sensitive skin, right? And I think that part of that, if you're always functioning in that type of environment, that's traumatic, right? So going back to psychological safety, I might do good work on paper, but that is starting to deteriorate who I am, right? So when we say bring your most authentic self to work, what we're really saying is the dominant majority is saying bring the version of yourself that I'm most comfortable with. And as Black employees, as Brown employees, Indigenous employees, we sometimes see ourselves through the eyes of dominant culture, right? And so we're not putting ourselves first. We're not putting our well-being first. We're often putting somebody else's and just sweeping under the rug. And so I had started to normalize this treatment, like many of us do, right? I used to tell myself, well, this is just how it's going to be for a Black woman at work. So Minda, just get your paycheck and keep it moving, right? But I realized that was deteriorating my mental health, always putting other people first, never saying that, yes, this did cause harm, because two things can be true at the same time. Someone might not have intended harm, but it still caused harm. So I have to center myself and acknowledge that this is not okay, because we have colleagues that don't have to deal with this every day and they get to do their work. It's safe for some, right? So again, how do we create psychological safety for everybody? It's part of equity. And we first, as James Baldwin says, America's been telling a lot of lies, and we first have to start by telling our truth and saying, yes, there is some workplaces and some behaviors that are harmful, and we can't confront what we're not willing to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah. Previously, you mentioned when you were explaining kind of the excerpt and psychological safety, you mentioned this word intent. Are these situations unintentional? And what would you say is the difference between intent versus impact when we think about racial trauma and psychological safety?
Absolutely. I think many of us, I can't imagine that if you are feel like you're on the margins or one of few, that you've never heard somebody tell you, oh, that's just Tom being Tom, right? Or that's just Kim being Kim. And no one ever holds them accountable for a better, for a higher learning, right? For showing up as their best self. And so people are always showing empathy for these people causing the harm. And I'm often like, well, what about the person on the receiving end of it? I'm glad that you can show up and tell me what they didn't mean, but we've never actually had a conversation. And last time I checked, you've never been a person of color in the workplace. So how do you know what's racist and what's not, right? All of this diminishing of our experiences. And I think that part of that is, again, holding this type of space and having these conversations. And for example, I had a manager, my first manager, who happened to be a white male, and he saw that I had burnt fingernail polish on. And he said, you people love your bright colors. And he joked around for 15 minutes about how Black people like bright colors. Now, everyone would always say, oh, that's just Chad being Chad, right? His intention might have been joking, but the impact of me hearing Chad say those things each and every day is traumatic, right? And it starts to affect, again, how we show up if we feel like we belong in spaces. And I feel like we can no longer let people opt into equity. We have to make it mandatory. So people like Chad or whomever, right, should not be able to continue being their most hurtful selves, right? It's harming other people. And so let's normalize us not feeling like we have to leave because of all the trauma, right? And move on from jobs that we really like doing. And let's normalize the people causing the problems, that they leave, right? Or that we hold them accountable to a better standard. And so part of even talking about trauma and race is saying, what would it look like to be free? We're in Black History Month. And so one definition of freedom is no longer feeling confined. I want us to all be successful, but at the end of the day, I'm rooting for all of our healing, because when we have some healing in our bones and we have some freedom, then we can release ourselves from all of these racial aggressions that we should have never been exposed to begin with.
Yeah, I love the idea of equity being mandatory rather than opt-in. We have to use that somewhere else. But you also mentioned your manager, and we at Zoom, we understand that managers have a lot of influence, and impact. In your book, you talked about a manager's pledge. Talk a little bit about that and tell us why that's important.
Yeah, I think like it's super important, right? When we think about equity in the workplace, oftentimes, I know in my personal experience, anytime that I was amplified or elevated or given a promotion, it was because I had a manager that was invested in my success. And I've interviewed over 200 women of color for both of my books, and one statistic that I love to share is that after doing the research, 70% of Black and brown women said that they felt like their managers were not invested in their success. And I correlate that to when you look at the C-suites in many companies, right? It's less than 4% of women of color that enter executive roles. And so I think that there's a direct correlation between a manager speaking our names in the rooms that we're not in, giving us those stretch assignments. Oftentimes, managerial bias can get in, and we tend to promote people who remind us of our younger selves or people that are our go-to, right? And oftentimes Black women or Black employees may not fall within that, right? So they may not see themselves in us. And so now we're working 10 times harder. And so I felt like there's an opportunity for managers to ask everybody on their team, what do you need from me to do the best work of your career while you're here, right? I never heard that from any of my managers, even the ones that gave me opportunities. But I think that, again, making it an equitable playing field. I put together the manager's pledge because I felt like we need managers who are committing to everyday acts of equity, right? Not at the end, but embedded in everything that they do. Understanding that everybody has bias, but what are we going to do to reconcile that? And even if you make a mistake, right? If you misgender someone, or if you, call somebody by the wrong pronoun, apologizing and recommitting to equity, right? Again, going back to this idea that, I'll do a lot of consulting for companies, and some leaders will say to me, well, I'm not comfortable talking about race. And I'll say, well, if you're not comfortable talking about race, then maybe you shouldn't be managing a diverse team, because they're not getting the best from you, right? And if you don't have the competencies, and these aren't soft skills, these are leadership skills, right? If you don't have conflict resolution, if you can't be an effective communicator, then ask your leadership for the tools so that you can be a better manager, right? So let's not go back to normal, let's go back to better. And part of that is asking managers, that middle management, to say you do have more power than you think. And what could that look like as you help promote and amplify others?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Again, going back to that idea of making equity mandatory for managers and employees. And
Absolutely.
you mentioned freedom a little bit earlier, and I kind of want to touch on that in a second. But what are some effective strategies for healing when you've experienced, racial trauma in the workplace? And does this connect to freedom in the workplace? Does this have a connection there?
I think so. I think that we do there is a connection to freedom. And I do think that many of us have not experienced freedom in the workplace because we have valued fear over ourselves. And some of us have been participating in our own oppression. We have not been activating our own voice in the matter, right? So how will your colleague know that they shouldn't be touching your hair if you never tell them, right? Again, it may like piss us off or whatever, and you would think, well, don't they know not to touch somebody else's hair as an adult, or unsolicited? But I used to get so upset with certain things that happened that way, and I had to also take into account, have I communicated this, that this is not okay, right? That I can give myself permission. Audre Lorde said, beware of feeling you're not good enough to deserve it. Do we not all deserve humanity, dignity, equity, and respect, right? And sometimes we have to let people know what good looks like to us. And so one tool that I have and right within is called the affirmation pyramid, because oftentimes we are the only ones in the room that we're in, right? And so when someone does say something, micro, macro, whatever have you, we're waiting on maybe somebody else to affirm us in that moment, right? Like, didn't you hear what they said? Can't believe so-and-so said that. And oftentimes we won't even get anyone to confirm that. Everybody knows that this was not okay, right? But we've moved on to the next agenda item. So part of that is affirming ourselves, right? I don't need anybody. I don't need to look around the room or the Zoom room to have someone affirm that I know I was disrespected, right? And I think part of our healing and our freedom is first honoring ourselves enough to say, that did harm me, right? It doesn't stop me on my journey, but that was harmful and that's not okay. And I think part of this, Lauryn Hill said, how you going to win if you ain't right within? We can't win if we keep pushing stuff under the rug, right? If we keep pretending that this stuff doesn't happen, because if we don't heal, if we don't get free, then the people that love us, the people that are rooting for us, they don't get the best version. And ultimately, we never get to meet the best version of ourselves, which is more healed, more whole, right? And so many of our ancestors never got a chance to really taste freedom, but we get the opportunity. And when we taste that freedom and when we create those boundaries, we leave that to the next generation, right? I think about being a beneficiary of so many Black women and men's courage, right? The names that we all have heard before: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Shirley Chisholm, all of those great people. But even the people that we don't know their names, we are direct beneficiaries of their courage. So when I get nervous, I think about who's going to be a beneficiary of my courage. So I got to say the thing. I got to do the thing, right? Because nobody benefits when we're cautious.
I need to write that down. Who is going to be the beneficiary of my courage? Oh, I love that so much. I love, love, love that so much. So you gave us some strategies, right? So does freedom mean showing up to the workplace as our best authentic selves? What does freedom look like? True freedom in the workplace. What does that look like?
No longer being beholden by somebody else's standards. Like, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about double consciousness back in 1903, right? Way back when, which means seeing ourselves through the eyes of someone else. Aren't we tired of seeing ourselves through the eyes of someone else? What would it look like if we see ourselves the way we need to see us, right? If we move a little bit differently. We know what it feels like to be nervous and paranoid and wondering if they said the thing or what were they really saying. And I'm saying, you know what, let's free ourselves from all of that. Also, Erica Badu, she said, if you don't pack light, all those bags gonna get in your way. So release that bag, right? If somebody thinks we're angry, they think we're aggressive, they think that has nothing to do with me, right? That's not who I am. And I'm no longer gonna be confined by people who won't even take the time to find out how to pronounce my name right? I'm not going to spin my wheels over this anymore, right? I'm going to tell you what I need to say. I'm going to say what I mean without saying it mean. But just like John gets to say what he needs to say, I'm going to give myself permission to say what I need to say, right? And then also, I'm going to be part of our healing is also our success is not a solo sport. So who else can we, that might be an ally, that might be a sponsor or a mentor, who else can provide support? So we aren't the only ones always having to say the thing and do the thing, right? Because there's other people in these rooms that could also activate their allyship and demonstrate. You know, I mentioned who's going to be a beneficiary of our courage. Well, who's going to be a beneficiary of your allyship? Right? So if you call yourself an ally, then who's benefiting from that? If ain't nobody benefiting from it, then keep it, you know. But if we're talking about equity, right, then we all have a part to play in this.
Yeah, you know, I want to go back for a second, because it's resonated with me a little bit when you talked about kind of affirming yourself or honoring yourself enough to say, okay, that bothered me, or you know, I didn't like that the way that made me feel, right? Or I'm triggered by that. And to me, that's linked to self-advocacy, right? So what are some ways that we can self-advocate in the workplace? What does self-advocacy mean in the workplace?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. For me, what I realized was I used to tell myself that I didn't have a voice because I felt like I'm the only Black woman here. I can't rock the boat, right? Just keep your head down. All those things that many of us have been told. But I realized that as I was doing that, I was shrinking myself at the expense of my own well-being. And I realized I had to come to a crossroads and say, I actually do have a voice. I just have to decide how I want to use it and tell myself a new story about myself, right? I'm no longer telling myself that I don't deserve this or just make it to 5, right? Or whatever stories we tell ourselves to try to make it through the day. And I just realized that I belong in every room I enter, but not every room deserves to have me. And part of my self advocacy is part of my self care, is part of my self love, right? So the minute that that's compromised, I need to reevaluate where I'm allowing myself into it because I'm going to, now that I have some freedom, I'm going to protect it by any means necessary, right? So I'm not going to let someone just say anything to me and think that that's okay. And because you know what they're going to do? They're going to say it to the next Black woman or the next Black man or the next Latinx person. And so we have to hold people accountable. And I have the capacity to do that. It's scary though, right? It's scary, but self-advocacy is so important because people won't know what good looks like if we don't tell them, right? You know, I hear from a lot of people that be like, well, Minda, why didn't someone on my team tell me this? I'm like, well, A, they probably didn't feel safe enough to tell you this because of the power dynamics, right? So that's at play. And then 2, they've probably been telling you in some nonverbal ways, but you have not adhered to the situation. Again, we could be working at the same place and experience that workplace very differently. And so if you are in the dominant culture, your experience is going to be different. Our experience is going to be different. But what are we going to do? Who's benefiting from our privilege? Who's benefiting from our courage? And again, if we do want to make workplace more equitable, then it's having these conversations so that, you know, our healing isn't just for us, it's for everyone. And I think part of healing and freedom is building trust. So if our colleagues have not done the best job, what does rebuilding look like? And I think part of our healing is definitely going to require some accountability.
I hope you all are snatching the quotes because Minda is dropping some gems here. I love the quote. I belong in every room I'm in, but every room I'm in does not deserve me. Absolutely love that and can attest to that. You mentioned self-love. How does self-advocacy in the workplace connect or link to self-love for you?
Yeah, it does. You know, I feel like it's so interesting, like being on this healing journey. Again, healing is a lifestyle, right? I'm not 100% healed, but every day I'm making sure that I keep my tools handy. And part of that love is understanding that I was engaging in, let's be honest, toxic relationships, even in the workplace. I know we don't often call them that, but I was engaged. I was in some abusive relationships, okay, in the workplace, and I thought that this is just again how I have to do it. I got to get my gold watch, right? You know, I got to be here till I'm 65 or whatever the story I was telling myself. And I realized that I love myself enough, even if the people around the room don't honor me in that way. I can honor myself, right? I kept thinking that I had to get this consensus from everybody in the room, but my love is my love, right? My worth is my worth. My worth is not tied to if Keith shows up for me or not, right? My worth is not tied to somebody meaning harm or not, but I know my worth, right? And when you understand what your worth could potentially be, you're not going to allow anybody to treat you poorly. And I think about it from this way too. If somebody was doing this to you, the way that you're being treated, or potentially in the past have been treated, would you want them to do that to someone you love, right? And if you don't want that, then let's show up and demonstrate what good could look like, because many of us have a lot more working to do, and we should be able to do the best work of our careers not harmed.
Yeah, yeah. And when we think about self-love, right, you dedicated right within to Black women, right, who have had to be strong for everyone but themselves. What does that mean for you to send that love to them? What compelled you to make that decision, to share your experiences, to send that love to Black women?
Yes, I just feel like Black women deserve all the love, right? We don't always get affirmed in the ways that other women do. And I wanted to let us know that we don't have to be strong at every turn, right? We're human. We have emotions. We can be vulnerable. There's a lot of different intersections that we sit at, and we've been conditioned to be strong for everybody else, but ourselves. So what could it look like? Back to the freedom, right? What would that look like to be? It's not selfish, but selfless, right? Because if I'm at my best, then I get to give my best, right? I'm pouring from my best. But if we don't have much left to give after a work after a hard work day, then we can't be strong for everybody but ourselves. And lastly, Black women in particular, we don't have as long life expectancy as some of our counterparts due to chronic stress. And I do believe, again, I'm not a professional of doctor or anything by the sort, but research does show that we are not living to our fullest life expectancy due to that chronic stress. And I think part of that is taking on everything, right? And then everybody thinks that we're like superhuman when we're human just like everybody else, right? And I think, again, showing people the various sides of us, and oftentimes some women have been able to be vulnerable, right? They've been able to cry, they've been able to show emotion, and sometimes as women of color we don't always get that or feel safe enough to do it. And so I'm just saying, what would it be to allow yourself to be free?
I love that. I think it also takes a level of accountability, right, to be free in the workplace. So I love that. When we look across corporate America, right, we see the diversity, equity, and inclusion teams, the employee resource groups, the chief diversity officers. But in your opinion, who is responsible for making our workplaces more equitable?
This may be a little, I don't know if it's controversial, but I do think it's everybody's role, right? I think that there's certain things that our leaders can do, because if you are in dominant culture, how are you demonstrating that exists here? I know that over the last 2 years, a lot of companies have made a lot of verbal commitments, and they've said racial justice is important, or more women in management is important. But let's actually go and drill down. Who's benefiting from this? Right? And making sure that it's demonstrated, because I know if trust has been broken, or if I'm in my healing journey, I need to be able to trust my leaders, right? And if they have made some missteps, then I want them to be transparent, right? Because that transparency is part of healing, is part of growth. And so I do believe that managers and leaders need to be clear and transparent, but then also as people of color, as Black and brown people, I do believe that it's time for us to speak our truths, right? 2 years ago, we weren't able to talk about these things on the scale that we can in the workplace. And in my life, I never thought that I would be talking about these things out loud, right? Outside of like a group text or things like that. And now we get to talk about those things. And how can we make the workplace better than we found it if we don't talk about our experiences, right? Otherwise, if we don't talk about these things that we're dealing with, then we can't make the workplace better for ourselves or for the next generation. And I don't want the next generation of Black employees to be crying the same tears that many of us have, or have the same traumas, right? I want them to pack light, but we have to do our work now to make sure that we hold people accountable, and let them know that equity is for everybody, right? Everybody should be able to experience a more equitable and safe workplace.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned is, bringing these issues to light, right? And being able to talk about these issues. So when we find ourselves in rooms where we are the only people who look like us, how do we find the courage to use our voice to speak about these things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And again, all of this takes courage, right? And I think for those on the other end of it, think about if somebody comes to you or you're in a room and someone speaks their truth that they know. Again, it might not be your same lived experience, but it doesn't mean that this person isn't experiencing it. So, what would it be to meet them with the same courage? Being a courageous listener, right? Because if someone comes and says something to you, it's probably been happening like 100 times and they finally just got the courage to come and talk to you about it right now, right? So meeting them with that same empathy, meeting them with a courageous ear and hearing them out, I think that that goes a long way. Asking probing questions, tell me more about that. And I think that ultimately we should be trying to get to solutions, right? We're not trying to shame somebody, we're not trying to label somebody racist or sexist or homophobic. If that's not the case, but we have to address some of these behaviors, right? Because we want to weed out these behaviors, not continue to grow and pour water on them so that they become monsters inside the house. And I think that part of that again is leaning into our courage and thinking this is bigger than me. This isn't just about me, right? I'm creating that space for the next person that comes behind me or sits next to me. And so the other part of that is I often ask myself, should I have this conversation or is it better coming from somebody else? And that goes back to our network, right? Do we have an executive sponsored? Is there a manager? Is there somebody on my team that I trust who can say, you know what, I noticed that Minda's been trying to come off mute for the last 10 minutes. Minda, did you have something that you wanted to chime in on? Like inserting yourself in that way, right? There are ways to do that. Or if you've experienced and you've seen that racial or any type of aggressions have been taking place, what would it look like if our counterparts go to HR and say, hey, I noticed that in the last few meetings there's been some language that I'm not comfortable with, so I know that some of my colleagues aren't either, and I want to be the one to bring it to your attention. It doesn't always have to be us, right? And if we're talking about equity, then it's everybody's issue. If I'm harmed, then that should be somebody else should be concerned about that too, right? And if our white counterparts show up in those ways, then that takes the pressure off of us. And I think that it's important for those voices to be heard as often, if not more.
Yeah, yeah. And I love how you've already kind of touched on ways that, we can kind of commit to equity, right? When we think about allyship and partnership. So what are some other ways, we can commit to equity, especially for those who may not be, educated in this space, in the DEI space?
Yeah, I think three things. Like all of us can be allies, all of us can lean into our courage. There's somebody who could benefit from that, right? But let us continue to listen to each other because we won't know about each other's experiences if we're not building those relationships. Let's educate, right? What would it look like? I don't have to be a woman of color to read Right Within or the memo. If I manage a diverse staff or I want to show up as a better ally, a more active ally, not a passive ally, then I need to read books like this, right? I don't have to ask all my Black colleagues what I need to do. I can actually start to educate my own self because we all have so much at our fingertips. And then lastly is activate, right? If you're listening and reading and all the podcasts and nobody's benefiting from it, then you got to ask yourself, am I really about that life, right? And so we want people who are about that life, listening, educating, and demonstrating, because I can't believe what you say if it's not in the demonstration.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't believe what you say if it's not in the demonstration. In other words, say what you mean what you say. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Minda, thank you so much. We are going to toss it over to Shaman for some audience Q&A. And I know folks have some raving questions that they're ready to ask. So Shaman, passing it over to you.
Thank you so much.